Detroit, Michigan in the 1980s grappled with economic decline, population loss, surging crime rates, and urban decay. Yet within this chaos stood a beacon of comfort, Chung's Cantonese Cuisine. Curtischin's debut book, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, chronicles his upbringing in an establishment that welcomed all, from the city's pioneering black mayor to its vibrant drag queen community. It was here that filmmaker and activist Curtischin came of age.
I'm a kid that grew up in a Chinese restaurant in the inner city of Detroit. You had crack cocaine, you had AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. But despite that, we had this really wonderful Chinese restaurant right in the heart of the inner city where my parents were able to raise me and my 5 siblings and offer us all these opportunities, skills, lessons in life to help us navigate that.
The memoir explores Chin's personal journey, including his experiences with racial identity, class, religion, and coming to terms with his sexuality, all while navigating a life in a diverse and evolving community.
The book is divided into 3 sections of 8 stories each. 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and 8 in college. And so I think those are the pivotal years, right, when you're just discovering who you are. It was a lot of like going back and forth of trying to figure out, well, how do I fit in? How do all these different aspects of my identity sort of like sit with each other?
Throughout the narrative, Chin reflects on the impact of significant events and the broader challenges faced by Asian Americans.
It's still a humor book, right? I mean, it's still a funny book, but it also does include these really serious topics. Come for the egg rolls, but stay for the talk on racism.
Woven around the restaurant's actual menu, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant serves as an homage to his family, his community, and the complexities of American identity.
I like to say that even though I don't work in a Chinese restaurant anymore, I feel like I'm still a Chinese waiter, meaning that I go through life asking people, how can I help you? Like, can I get you something? I just feel like it's a good attitude to have in life. How do you make people's interaction with you, whatever amount of time you have with them, a little bit more pleasurable? I think a little more kindness in the world would be good.
Today, I'm here with the author of the book, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, Curtischin. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Excited to be here.
Okay, so you're on a great big tour of the United States talking about, is this your first book?
It's my first book.
So you're talking about your first book. Why don't you give us the synopsis of the book?
Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant is about growing up in Detroit during the 80s, a very difficult time period for my hometown. And to me, writing the book isn't just retracing my own childhood, it's also a thank you to my parents and also a hat tip to Detroit, because I feel like my hometown still gets a pretty bad rap. And so I wanted to show that, yeah, despite all these challenges, Detroit was a really great place to grow up.
Let's talk a little bit about what you go through, because you kind of take us through your life as a restaurant kid, I think is what you called yourself, all the way through your move out of Michigan and beginning your life on your own.
Well, the opening line to the book is, welcome to Chung's, is this for here to go, right? It's a common phrase that you hear going into a lot of dining establishments, right? It's the line that my dad would use, anybody that walked in the door. And so for me, it's sort of pulling that phrase and using it as a line to examine my own life, because like I said, Detroit was going through a lot of troubles at that time, right? But at the same time, I loved growing up there. My family was there, my cousins, everybody. I got all the free food I wanted, but at the same time, literally all my favorite buildings on our street were burning down. People were getting killed. And so it was the struggle for me. Also, trying to come out at that time. Like, do I stay in Detroit or do I have to go off and find my own world?
Your family's restaurant, was it in a prosperous area of Detroit, or?
No, we were in what's called the casscorridor, which was actually the red light district. It was the worst area. When you say the rough part of Detroit, you're talking about the casscorridor, which has been rebranded as Midtown now, but I still know it as the corridor.
How was it challenging to you and your family at all?
Well, luckily for us, we had this little small bubble within that neighborhood called Chinatown. And by Chinatown, I mean like 6 restaurants, including 1 Indian. You know what I mean? So it's very, very small. My parents would not let us go beyond 1 block either way. But within that block, it was just a great, fun place to grow up. But I also saw it changing over that time. And like when I was really young, I remember things like Tuesday movie nights where they bring in Hong Kong action flicks. Every year we would have festivals like the Miss Chinatown beauty pageant, the Lunar New Year, Autumn Festival. We had Chinese school. So a lot was happening within that little bubble. But as we got older and the community started to dissipate and there was more crime that was seeping into our actual area, I could sadly see the area going away.
And when you say your parents, they were there in Detroit, are your parents from Detroit as well?
Yeah, the restaurant was opened by my great-grandfather in 1940. And so I like to talk about my family's journey. The prologue is actually about my family's journey, how my great-great-grandfather moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there weren't any Chinese people there, and then moving up to Detroit, tried to get a job in the auto industry, couldn't land a position because he didn't speak English, and so he started doing the hand laundry, saved up enough money to eventually open a grocery store and then a Chinese restaurant in 1940, and it actually continues all the way to 67 because in Detroit, like much of the country, there was a lot of racial strife, right? Tension. The National Guard was called in Detroit, and for the first time ever, my parents actually had to close the restaurant for 5 straight days. But in that time period, they also managed to find time to have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. And so a lot of times people will ask me, why do you talk about racial justice and social equality so much? And I say, well, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around. So I kind of have to talk about these things. My family's been in Detroit since the late 1800s. I mean, we saw the boom years, the Great Migration moving up, through, the difficulties of the 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, that was my childhood.
So can you describe a bit about what it was that you learned in the restaurant? You say everything.
There's so many lessons, not just from cooking to playing mahjong, all this fun stuff. But I like to say that the very first lesson that I learned was actually probably the most important lesson. When you're a little kid, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers. My parents actually gave us the exact opposite instruction.
Really?
They said talk to strangers. Who they were talking about were the people sitting in our dining room, because my mom had an arranged marriage, right? She came to this country at the age of 17, didn't finish high school. She didn't know what opportunities existed outside those 4 walls. Neither did my dad, who went to community college for 2 semesters. But they knew there was this dining room full of people who actually did. And so anytime my dad met somebody who he thought had a cool job or just sounded really interesting, he'd call all 6 of us kids to run over and barrage these customers with questions of what do you do for a living? How did you get your job? How much money did you make? And so this idea of being able to talk to people who are different from you, but also not being afraid to ask questions about things that you don't know, and also not to be afraid of asking for help if you need it. These are all basic things that my parents really taught, as kids, and it allowed us to navigate the world.
How big was the Chinese and Chinese American community that you interacted with during these years of your life?
At one point, there actually was an older Chinatown before I came around in Detroit that I believe was as big as 4,000 people. So it was quite large, right? But by the time I sort of came around and the city had destroyed that old Chinatown, much the way they had destroyed other neighborhoods, communities of color, to build a freeway, that Chinatown that I grew up in was only about 200 people. And a lot of them were old bachelors, the remnants of the old Chinese Exclusion Act, when they didn't allow, the Chinese to come into this country.
And what do you mean by that? I don't think that's as widely known as you and I might know about it.
The Chinese Exclusion Act barred basically Chinese from immigrating, perceiving us as a labor threat. And so our communities weren't allowed to grow and develop. So what happened was that a lot of the early Chinese American immigrants came in to work on the railroad, to do mining, to do all this hard labor, but they weren't allowed to bring over their families. They basically were just used as a labor force. A lot of those people are still around. When I was growing up, they were getting into the age of, the 80s and 90s. So I had exposure to those people. But yeah, it's very small, very few kids, very few families per se.
So what was the clientele for your restaurant, maybe in the 70s and 80s?
That's one of the beautiful things about Chinese restaurants. Restaurants in general, but I think Chinese restaurants in particular, is that you do have a really diverse clientele, right? I mean, like I like to joke, it's like, black or white, rich or poor, Christian or Jewish, we took everybody's money. It didn't matter. And I think that historically, you saw that in the early parts, Chinese restaurants were welcoming of everybody.
Well, how do you think, or do you think, you're different from your parents as how you view your life and how you have viewed your life here in the United States? Both your parents, well, your mom was from Canton.
Yeah, my mom's an
Guangdong,
immigrant.
so, yeah.
My mom's an immigrant, but my dad was born here. So in some ways, I'm more like my dad, right? Interestingly, my dad never really talked about his childhood, but through this book tour that I've been on, I've had a lot of people come from not just my past, but my parents' past. Like one of his high school buddies showed up, and he showed me pictures of my dad's yearbook. And I never seen that, and my dad's no longer with us. But I noticed that my dad had done things that I had done, but he never brought it up. Like, for instance, he was on student council. He was a young Republican. He went to this thing called Boys State,
What's that?
Boys State? Boys State is this incredible program where they take 2 boys from each state, from each high school, and they send you to the state capitol to participate in all this government programs. I think John F. Kennedy did it, Bill Clinton did it, you know what I mean? It's a really prestigious program, and they have a girls' state version of it too. But, when I went through the program, I had no idea that my dad had also done that program.
Now, your mom seemed to drive a lot of the story in the book, or at least your interaction with your mom. How do you describe that in the book?
Well, I mean, basically wrote the book for my mom in some ways, right? Because she's had such a hard life, and she always wanted people to know more about her struggles. And so I do talk about it in the book, like the challenges that she went through.
What's a little more of her background?
So her family was actually in America in the 1800s as well. But again, because of the immigration laws in America, her family wasn't able to come in. Just like the men could come over, right? But the women, didn't come over. So she was actually still born there. So they start off as peasants, or poor, because those are the poorest people that came to America first. But because her grandfather and her uncles were here in America working, they were able to send money back. And so they actually had achieved some amount of, privilege back in China. But then when the communists came south, where they lived, they really, faced a lot of hardship. Like even at the, age of like 4 or 5 years old, she'd been thrown into jail. The communists confiscated all of their property. She had to escape, under, very difficult circumstances. And then after that, she goes to Hong Kong. She's 17 years old. She gets, married off to this stranger from Detroit, And I say in the book that she knew 2 things about Detroit. One is that they made great cars, and 2 is they made better music. So that was it, right? Coming to Detroit, she had a lot of difficulties because my grandmother did not accept her. And so, yeah, she had a tough life.
And your grandmother really seemed like she didn't accept you either.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Did I misread that? But it really came off.
Her opening line in the book is Mo Young, which is useless, which is basically how she saw us kids. Yeah.
Was it just you, or was it all of your siblings?
All of our siblings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and probably my mom too, and probably my dad. Yeah, she had no use for any of us.
And this is your dad's mom.
My dad's mom.
Right.
Which is really interesting, though, because sometimes people will ask me, like, well, you have family members in your life that who maybe are not so kind or who do bad things. How do you write about them, right? Like, And so for me, I was like, no, you just have to write what you know, and hopefully you're not a mean person, because at the end of the day, it is just your perspective. I'll give you a follow-up story to that, is that when I was doing my pre-publicity for the book before it came out, I was in Texas. And the organizers were meeting me at a restaurant. They got there early, and so they said, oh, please come down, meet us. And so I call an Uber. I go downstairs to wait on the street for it. But a woman just happens to be standing there, a Chinese woman. And she turns around and she sees my sweatshirt, says Detroit versus everybody. And so she asks me, "Oh, are you from Detroit?" And I said, "Yeah." And we started talking, and it turned out that her mom was best friends with my grandmother.
Wow.
And so she just started saying all these really nice things about my grandmother, saying, "She's the sweetest person ever. She had candy in her pocket. She taught me how to drink American coffee." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's not the grandma I knew." But she was really insistent. Like, she was really trying to convince me that my grandmother was a good person. And I didn't want to fight her on it because I wouldn't want my grandmother to go through life unloved. Like, I'm glad somebody loved her, right? I mean, it just wasn't me. But then, so the car comes and I leave. But then a couple days later, I realized that was probably my grandmother sending an emissary from the grave telling me that, you've totally, misrepresented it. You need to change this before the book comes out. You know what I mean? But no, I didn't change it. Because at the end of the day, it is what it is. That's my memory, right? And so for people out there who want to write memoirs and want to write about their family, I encourage them to just go ahead and write. Because even if your family member is dead and buried, they're still going to not like what you say. And they're still going to let you know.
And it seems like after she had a stroke, or the massive stroke, I guess,
Yeah.
it seemed like maybe she softened a little bit toward you and the family, or did I read that incorrectly?
Obviously, when you have a massive stroke, there's only so much you can do. I mean, obviously, her influence in the restaurant waned because before that, she really was the one that dictated everything, like who got hired, what dishes were on the menu, everything. And so, yeah, it was hard, right? Because she was a woman who did work, and she did have a tough life. In her defense, she did have a tough life, because she had also been born in China to poverty, came to this country. But yeah, she really couldn't do anything. She couldn't make her famous egg rolls anymore. And so I think that I softened a little bit to her. I mean, I don't know if I ever got to the point of fully embracing her, but at least I got to the point of at least understanding her.
It seemed like you backed off a bit, but she seemed like a very dominant, just kind of presence over everything.
Yeah, like I was just back in Detroit. I just flew in this morning from Detroit. I went to their gravesite and I gave them flowers.
Did you go back to see the grave of your grandmother? Did it seem more out of field piety, or was it just out of respect, or why did you feel a need to do that with your grandmother?
I'm working on a second memoir now, and it would focus on my dad's passing. And I was living in LA at the time, and so I'd gone back. And so I was just trying to retrace some of the places I went to around that time period, and that was one of them. I had gone to her grave. I was a little sad going back this time because it had seemed like nobody had been there in a while. And my family had left, and a lot of my aunts and uncles have also left the area. So it was a little sad going back there.
So you grew up also different than maybe your siblings, as well as, like you mentioned, that you were a young Republican supporting Ronald Reagan and all of that when you were growing up. What was that like? Because at least from the description of your older siblings, it seemed like there was just kind of you were very different people, at least.
Yeah, I was an outlier in so many ways. So in my defense, this was the 80s, and Ronald Reagan, the Republicans had come to Detroit and they had their convention there. Ronald Reagan, said he was going to make America great again. And, one of the stereotypes against Asians is that we're not very loyal to America. And so I took it upon myself that I was going to, out-patriot all the white kids at our school. And so I became what was known as the Asian Alex P. Keaton. I don't know if that means anything. Like
from Family Ties.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, and so
you were the young Republican.
I was young Republican. I was class president of the National Honor Society. I co-founded the Young Republican Club, Students Against Smoking. Margaret Thatcher was my imaginary girlfriend. I was like a total right-winger back then. But over the course of the book, I do change. I learn about policies. I learn about ideas, and that's part of going off to the University of Michigan and meeting friends from different parts of the state and even parts of the country, and opening my eyes to different opinions and then changing.
Was there any one event that kind of led you to actually be more political?
Yeah, so one of the key moments in Asian American history, and definitely Asian American political history, is the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit in the 80s. This was the height of the anti-Japanese automobile sentiments. Vincent was a Chinese American out celebrating his upcoming wedding. At some point, these two white auto workers come in, and they're overheard saying it's because of you mother blanks that we're out of work. They get kicked out of the bar, but these guys get in their car, and they drive around the city until they find Vincent sitting in a McDonald's. They take a baseball bat out of their car, and they bash his head in, and they kill him. my uncle was his best man, and our families were close. And so we found out that very next morning that he was in the hospital struggling, fighting for his life and in a coma. And, you know, if you're a young kid and you know somebody that's been brutally beaten like that, you're going to check the papers to find out what they say. I checked the papers, the news, nothing, right? Next day, nothing. Next day, nothing, nothing. It took 12 days before the media even reported on that story. And by that time, Vincent's family had decided to pull the plug. The wedding had been canceled. All the people in the community were coming to our restaurant trying to find out information on what had happened. Meanwhile, the media didn't report on this at all. And so months later, when the judge sentenced these two guys to only $3,000 fine, not having to serve a single day in jail, we were just shocked as a community. And especially when the judge said something to the effect of, you don't put these type of people in jail, meaning white middle-class people with jobs. You know, otherwise they'll be surrounded by criminals. And we're like, they are criminals. They just killed somebody. And I do honestly believe that if the media had done a better job of, like, not just covering the Vincent Chin story, but just covering the Asian American community in general, presenting Asians as part of the fabric of the city, I don't think that judge would have given that sentence like that.
You don't?
I don't think so. Judging from his statements, it was clear who he was siding with, right? Because in the justice system in America, we always have to have the victim and the perpetrator. And oftentimes people of color are not given that privilege, right, of being the victim. We're always sometimes the aggressor or whatever. Even back then, people would say things like, well, he shouldn't have been in a strip club, you know what I mean? Like they were blaming Vincent for his own death, right? And I think that that is why narrative is so important, right? Like who's telling whose story, who's presenting who as, you know, the person you're supposed to empathize with. I think that if the judge had just for one moment empathized with Vincent's fiance, right? Or had empathized with Vincent's mom, or even just Vincent, who was 27 years old at the time and ready to start a new job as a draftsman. I mean, he had his whole future ahead of him. Why didn't the judge ever think about, you know, Vincent's loss or the loss, you know, of that family when coming up with the sentence?
How did that incident and the coverage of that incident affect you? Do you think that got you to speak up more or speak out more?
Well, yeah, I mean, it did, because when I didn't see anything in the papers, I immediately lugged the typewriter from the back kitchen to the dining room. You know what typewriters are? You know those little things?
We're the same age, yes, I know.
Okay. So I would just be in the back, like, typing these letters to the editor, right, trying to get them to, like, you know, talk about that, but then other things, because remember, I was a right-winger back then, so I would, like, write these terrible, you know, letters to the editor, like bemoaning Madonna and her terrible cultural influence on young people and how she was, like, you know, spoiling people's minds, stuff like that. But it just got me this idea of, like, the media, of writing, of storytelling.
And you talked about that transition when you did go to Michigan and actually changing some of your other opinions as well. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, you go off to college and you learn different things and you meet different people, different opinions. So I do gradually shift throughout the book. There were like 3 policies that really specifically I codified as to how I moved away from being a Republican. The first was apartheid. I didn't understand how Reagan could support the policy in South Africa, which was clearly racist to me. Second one was AIDS. At that point, the Republicans had this policy called compassionate conservatism, which at first I thought was great because we're Buddhists, right? We're taught compassion, but then, you know, you'd be hanging around these people and there really wasn't much compassion at all. And the third was abortion, because as a gay guy who had no plans of having sex with a woman and getting anybody pregnant, I had no problem being pro-life and seeing anti-choice. But when I went to college, I met a couple women who really impressed on me that it's about controlling your own body. It's about being able to decide things for yourself. And when I made that connection between that and being a closeted gay man, I thought, like, yeah, there's no way, I don't want to be a hypocrite, right? And so if I want to have the freedom to do what I want to do, then I have to give, you know, other people that right too. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of shifted me over. But it was a process. It took time. I mean, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And since the coronavirus kind of came out and we got a lot of I'll call it straight up nonsense, blaming anybody who's of East Asian descent on spreading the virus, or actually calling people the virus. You are the virus. Yeah. Did you feel a necessity to write this book because of what was happening then? Did it come up that I need to put something out into the world to talk about my background, or did you already have this idea percolating well before?
Well, I was already writing the book before that, so I don't know. I will have to say that probably that did help selling the book, in the sense that, you know, there was an increased interest in hearing the Asian American perspective. I think also Asian Americans started to want to learn more about their own history as well. And I think other people who are not Asian also started to seek out more books by Asian Americans to sort of figure out what that story is. And so it has had an impact, but I don't know if it affected my writing per se of the actual stories, because you know, by that time I kind of had a clear idea. Where it did affect it was, you know, I started talking more about the older ages and stuff like that and how that fit in, you know. But obviously throughout my whole life I've grappled with these issues, right? Because, you know, from a very early age I learned the term hate crimes, and I don't know if most kids grow up with that.
But you actually started talking about it, which I think is a thing that was not really talked about. I've been involved in forums, especially since the coronavirus hit, and we're only, 6 miles away from Ferguson, where Mike Brown was killed. We're right here when that happened 10 years ago this summer. And I think those incidents, as they came up, kind of allowed a new generation, people who are not our age, to actually find their voice and actually say something. And I found out a lot of these stories existed. Your story, people younger than us, those stories existed, but were never spoken out loud. I think in a lot of ways because of the way your mom maybe acted toward you. She told you, don't say anything, just not get along to get along, but you know, don't stick up. Don't do that. And it seems like maybe the lid's off that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, particularly if you have immigrant parents who, you know, come to this country hoping to have success for their family, I honestly believe that they think that discrimination is part of the bargain of coming to America. You're going to deal with it to some degree, but at the end of the day, on paper, it's still a great opportunity. So, you know, there's no point in really complaining about it, right? But I think that the kids who are born here and we live our whole lives here, we have a much higher bar in terms of what we expect out of America, right? We expect full citizenship. We expect full equality. Is
there anything else that you would like to say about your book, or even the transition into adulthood? I don't want you to give up the next book that you're writing, but that you'd like to talk about with this, because this was a very interesting look. And I think for people who may or may not be familiar with that many Asian Americans, it kind of shines a light on where these folks came from, where they might have gone to a Chinese restaurant, but it's a really big insight into the life of a kid who was behind the restaurant counter working for their parents. Is there anything you want to add to that you can?
You know, I feel very lucky that I had the childhood that I did. I mean, on paper, you know, I'm a kid that grew up in a Chinese restaurant in the inner city of Detroit, right? You might think that that'd be an awful experience, right?
Not necessarily, but okay.
I think some people might think of that.
I believe that too.
You know, but I love my experience. I mean, I'll name drop here, but when I was invited to the White House when Obama, you know, had won, I was literally in the White House standing with the president and the first lady, and I thought, like, wow, I get to have these wonderful experiences coming from my background. And so it renews my faith in America, but also just like my own childhood, you know, this wonderful experience I had with my family, the food. It was a great childhood. And I know that not everybody, you know, growing up in a Chinese restaurant has that, because it is a hard life, right? But like for me, I always try to look on the bright side of things, and so I think I had the best childhood.
So you think it's morning in America?
I use all the same phrases, but you know, I'm an eternal optimist. That doesn't mean that I'm unaware of things, but I just feel like we accept these things. I mean, maybe that's a Buddhist philosophy, right? Like life is about suffering. bad shit happens. Do you know what I mean? And so when you do see the good things in life, you stress that instead because they're the fleeting things, right? And so maybe that's where I get my worldview about that. So,
Curtischin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great, thank you.